In the original era of Dragon Ball, fighting was not about destruction, it was about mastery. Early Dragon Ball presented combat as a martial art in the truest sense of the word, a discipline of body, mind, and spirit. No character embodied this philosophy more than Master Roshi. Roshi did not train warriors to become weapons. He trained them to become better versions of themselves. His training philosophy was simple, but revolutionary. Strength was not given. Strength was built. Roshi's training focused on fundamentals rather than spectacle. His students were forced to perform physical labor, carry heavy loads, and perform repetitive conditioning exercises. The goal was not to create fighters who could destroy opponents. The goal was to create fighters who could survive themselves. Because the real enemy in martial arts is not the opponent in front of you. It is your own exhaustion, your own impatience, your own fear. Early Dragon Ball treated martial arts like meditation in motion. Fighting was not about aggression, it was about control. Control of movement. Every strike had intention. Every dodge had purpose. Combat was treated almost like a conversation between bodies. The Tenkichi Budokai tournaments reinforced this philosophy. Fighters did not always hate each other. They tested each other. They respected technique. They respected discipline. They respected improvement. Competition was not about crushing opponents. It was about discovering how far you could push yourself. This philosophy is central to the character of Goku. Goku represents a radical interpretation of martial arts philosophy. He does not treat fighting as duty. He treats fighting as curiosity. Goku wants to know what happens when he faces stronger opponents. He does not fear defeat because defeat is information. Every loss is a lesson. Every injury is feedback. This mindset would become one of the defining philosophical pillars of the entire franchise. Because in Dragon Ball, growth is more important than victory. Winning fights does not define strength. Adapting during fights does. This is why early Dragon Ball fights often involved strategy rather than raw power escalation. Characters had to think, observe, react. Strength was not just physical, it was psychological. The original Dragon Ball era established something that would remain true across the entire series. Battle is a tool for character development, not just plot advancement, not just action spectacle. Character transformation happens through conflict, which is why training arcs were just as important as battle arcs, because training represents internal growth, and fighting represents external testing. Dragon Ball's early philosophy was simple but powerful. The strongest fighter is not the one who defeats the most enemies. It is the one who continues improving even after defeat. And that idea would follow the series into its later, more complex philosophical eras. In the world of Dragon Ball Z, fighting stopped being just self-improvement. It became something deeper, something darker, something more personal. The Saiyan race, especially through characters like Vegeta, introduced a new philosophy of battle. Battle was no longer curiosity, it was validation. For Vegeta, strength wasn't just survival, it was proof that he deserved to exist. Saiyan pride is not confidence, it is survival psychology turned into ideology. Vegeta fights not to grow, he fights to prove superiority. He fights to maintain hierarchy. He fights to never feel powerless again after years of cosmic domination under Frieza. This is where Dragon Ball becomes more emotionally complex, because now, fights are not just about strength. They are about ego, they are about trauma, they are about legacy. Unlike Goku, who treats combat like self-expression, Vegeta treats combat like reputation management. Goku fights because he wants to see what happens when he pushes himself further. Vegeta fights because he is terrified of being weak again. This difference defines the emotional engine of Dragon Ball Z. Saiyan pride is both strength and curse, because pride creates warriors who refuse to quit. But it also creates warriors who cannot accept help. This philosophy is shown through Vegeta's early behavior: arrogance, brutality, and obsession with dominance. He does not respect opponents. He measures them. Can they threaten him? If yes, they must be destroyed. If no, they are irrelevant. Saiyan battle philosophy is social ranking through violence. Strength equals worth. Weakness equals death. But Dragon Ball constantly challenges this worldview. Goku is the living contradiction to Saiyan ideology. He does not fight to dominate. He fights to understand limits. This philosophical conflict becomes one of the longest-running character dynamics in the entire franchise, because every fight between Goku and Vegeta is not just a physical battle, it is a philosophical argument. Vegeta represents inherited warrior culture. Goku represents self-made identity. One fights to protect status, the other fights to experience growth. And over time, Vegeta's philosophy begins to crack, because Dragon Ball is not a story about who is strongest. It is a story about who is willing to change. Saiyan pride begins as strength, but eventually it becomes Vegeta's greatest obstacle, because true power in Dragon Ball is not dominance, it is evolution. And evolution requires letting go of who you used to be, which is something Vegeta will spend years learning. And sometimes learning comes through humiliation, and sometimes humiliation is how warriors are reborn.
In Dragon Ball Z, the meaning of battle changed dramatically. No longer was fighting just about training. No longer was it just about pride. Now, battle became survival. And survival introduced something new to Dragon Ball philosophy. Trauma, the introduction of. Frieza transformed the narrative meaning of strength. Frieza was not a martial artist. He was a cosmic aristocrat of destruction. He did not train. He did not improve. He simply was powerful. This created a direct philosophical contradiction to everything Dragon Ball had built up to that point. Because characters like Goku represented earned strength, Frieza represented inherited tyranny. The conflict was not just physical, it was ideological. Frieza believed power justified oppression, Goku believed power created responsibility. This philosophical clash reached its peak on planet Namek. The battle between them was not just about saving the planet, it was about breaking a system of cosmic domination. The Super Saiyan transformation became one of the most important philosophical moments in the franchise, because it was not just rage, it was awakening. It was generational trauma turning into resistance. For Vegeta, this arc was even more personal. Vegeta represented the psychology of a conquered warrior race. He was raised inside a hierarchy, built on domination. For him, strength was survival. Weakness meant extinction. But Vegeta's humiliation under Frieza forced a psychological breakdown, because for the first time, Vegeta was forced to confront that his philosophy of pure dominance was insufficient. Dragon Ball began introducing a new concept here. Strength alone does not guarantee victory. Willpower, emotion, identity, and purpose matter just as much. Frieza's defeat also introduced a darker Dragon Ball theme. Humiliation can become fuel for evolution, but it can also become obsession. Vegeta's character arc would later be defined by this idea. He was not just fighting enemies, he was fighting the memory of being powerless. The Frieza saga transformed Dragon Ball into a mythological struggle about freedom versus oppression. Combat was no longer just sport, it was liberation. And that idea would continue shaping Dragon Ball as its stakes grew larger, its villains grew stronger. Its philosophical questions became more complex.
In Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball reached one of its most philosophically complex turning points. The conflict between Gohan and Cell was not just about strength. It was about whether someone is forced to become a fighter, even if they don't want to be one. Gohan was different from every warrior before. Unlike Goku, who loved fighting, Gohan saw battle as something necessary but painful. He did not share his father's philosophy of combat as joy. Gohan represented the moral cost of being born into a warrior legacy. He had power, but he did not want it. This created one of Dragon Ball's most emotionally tragic philosophical ideas. Sometimes potential is not freedom. Sometimes it is responsibility you never asked for. The Cell Games arc forced Gohan into a psychological breaking point. Cell was not just physically powerful. He was philosophically dangerous. Cell represented perfection through assimilation. He did not grow through training. He grew by absorbing others. This contrasted directly with Dragon Ball's core philosophy of earned strength. Cell was evolution without effort, growth without discipline, power without identity. The fight between Gohan and Cell was therefore a narrative experiment. What happens when the strongest fighter is someone who does not want to fight? Gohan's transformation into Super Saiyan 2 was not born from pride. It was born from rage, grief, and emotional overload. The death of Android 16 became the emotional trigger for Gohan's awakening. 16's final message to Gohan was one of the most important philosophical statements. Protect nature. Protect life. Fight only when necessary. This philosophy directly challenged Cell's worldview. Because Cell believed power justified domination, Gohan's power surge represented something new. Battle could be motivated by compassion rather than ego, but victory came at a cost. After defeating Cell, Gohan's arc did not become one of triumph. It became one of loss. Because Gohan did not want to be the strongest. He wanted a peaceful life. Dragon Ball used this arc to ask a difficult question. Is strength still meaningful if it destroys the life you wanted to live? The Cell Saga turned battle into tragedy. Power was no longer just something to achieve. It was something that changed who you were. And sometimes, becoming strong meant losing pieces of yourself along the way.
In Dragon Ball Z, battle philosophy took its darkest psychological turn during the Buu saga. This was the moment where combat stopped being about growth and started becoming about identity crisis. No character embodied this better than Majin Vegeta. Vegeta's decision to allow himself to be possessed was not about gaining power. It was about reclaiming his sense of self. Because by this point in the story, Vegeta had already begun to change. He had a family, he had experienced mercy. He had tasted humility through defeats against Goku, and that terrified him, because Saiyan pride was still the foundation of Vegeta's identity. Battle was not just competition for him, it was proof that he was still a warrior. So Vegeta made a horrifyingly honest decision. He chose evil again, not because he wanted to destroy the world, but because he wanted to feel like himself again. Majin Vegeta represents one of Dragon Ball's most uncomfortable philosophical ideas. Growth is not always comfortable. Some people resist change even when they know it is better for them. Vegeta's fight against Goku during the Buu saga was not about winning. It was about self-recognition. Vegeta knew he had changed. But he was not ready to live as a man who cared about others. So he created a scenario where he could prove he was still the warrior prince of legend. But the fight itself revealed something deeper. Vegeta was no longer fighting to dominate Goku. He was fighting to prove he still had control over his own narrative. The final sacrifice against Majin Buu was therefore one of the most important character moments in Dragon Ball history. For the first time, Vegeta chose protection over pride. He admitted that he was no longer the man he used to be. His final words to Goku were not about victory, they were about legacy. Protecting his family became more important than preserving his warrior status. This was Dragon Ball's philosophy evolving again. Strength was no longer just about physical power, it was about emotional responsibility. Vegeta's sacrifice showed that true strength sometimes means accepting that you have changed, and that growth is not weakness, it is evolution. Vegeta's arc transformed Dragon Ball's definition of pride. Pride was no longer about being the strongest. Pride became about protecting what you love, even if it cost you everything. In Dragon Ball Super, Dragon Ball's philosophy of battle expanded beyond human emotion. Fights were no longer just about warriors. They became about gods, universes, and existential purpose. The introduction of beings like Beerus changed everything, because Beerus was not a traditional villain. He was a natural force of balance. He did not fight to dominate. He fought to maintain cosmic order. This shifted Dragon Ball's philosophy again. Battle was no longer just personal growth. It became theological. Standing above mortals were divine beings who treated combat like language. Their fights were conversations about existence itself. Beerus's relationship with Goku is especially important. Goku did not fight Beerus to defeat him. He fought to understand him. This reflects Goku's consistent philosophy. Strength is a means of connection, not separation. This idea was expanded further through characters like Whis. Whis represents a higher philosophical state than even the gods of destruction. While gods destroy, angels observe and guide. Whis teaches that true strength is emotional and mental control. Perfect combat is not chaos. It is precision and calmness under pressure. This philosophy culminates in one of the most important transformations, Ultra Instinct. Ultra Instinct represents the elimination of ego from combat. The body moves without conscious thought. There is no anger, no pride, no fear, only instinctual perfection. Ultra Instinct is the final evolution of Roshi's early philosophy. Control your body, control your mind, control your emotions. But in Super, this philosophy reaches divine levels. Battle becomes enlightenment through combat. This is also where Dragon Ball introduces a new philosophical rival archetype through Jiren believes strength comes from emotional detachment. He believes dependence on others creates weakness. His power comes from self-reliance and trauma-driven discipline. But Dragon Ball challenges this philosophy because Goku's victories often come from connection. Friends, mentors, rivals. Jiren represents isolation. Goku represents community. The Tournament of Power became a philosophical experiment. What kind of strength deserves survival? Strength without compassion, or strength that grows through bonds? Dragon Ball Super ultimately reframes battle as a universal language. Fighting is not just violence, it is communication across species, universes, and ideologies. And as Dragon Ball moves forward, its philosophy continues evolving. Because every new opponent is not just stronger, they represent a new idea about what strength actually means. In Dragon Ball Super, Dragon Ball introduced a villain who was not interested in strength through training. He was interested in strength through feeding. That villain was Moro. Moro represents the opposite of everything Dragon Ball philosophy stands for. If early Dragon Ball said strength is earned, if Saiyan philosophy said strength is identity, if Super said strength is enlightenment, Moro represents strength as predation. Moro does not train, he does not grow, he consumes. He steals energy from planets, civilizations, and fighters themselves. This makes Moro one of Dragon Ball's most terrifying philosophical villains, because he represents power without effort, evolution without discipline, strength without self-improvement. Moro is anti-Dragon Ball ideology. His philosophy directly contradicts characters like Goku. Goku's power comes from pushing his body beyond limits. Moro's power comes from removing limits from others. Where Dragon Ball traditionally celebrates perseverance, Moro celebrates exploitation. He is not just fighting warriors, he is erasing the concept of earned strength itself. Moro also represents a darker cosmic theme. He is a parasite of life force. He treats existence like a resource to be harvested. This makes his conflict feel less like a traditional fight, and more like a moral and existential threat, because Moro does not just want to win battles, he wants to end the possibility of future battles. He wants to stop growth. He wants to freeze evolution. This is why his defeat is philosophically important. Moro is defeated not just by strength, but by Dragon Ball's core philosophy. Perseverance, Moro, by proving that strength stolen from others cannot surpass strength built through struggle. Moro becomes the narrative warning of Dragon Ball's modern era. Power without discipline eventually collapses, because power must be connected to purpose, otherwise it becomes corruption. And Dragon Ball continues reinforcing its central idea. Battle is not about destruction, it is about transformation. Across Dragon Ball, one idea has remained constant. Fights are never really about the opponent in front of you. They are about the person you become while fighting. This philosophy reaches its highest and most dangerous form through characters like Zamasu. Zamasu represents philosophical corruption taken to its absolute extreme. He does not want strength. He wants moral perfection enforced through destruction. He believes mortals are flawed by nature, and therefore must be erased. Unlike earlier villains who wanted power, Zamasu wanted ideological purity. This made him one of the most terrifying threats in Dragon Ball history, because he represents what happens when justice becomes fanaticism. His conflict with future Trunks is especially meaningful. Trunks represents survival through sacrifice. He fights not for philosophy, not for pride, but for hope. Trunks is the embodiment of Dragon Ball's emotional legacy. Even when the world is destroyed, he continues fighting, not because he wants power, but because he wants tomorrow to exist. This leads to the final evolution of Dragon Ball's combat philosophy. Battle is not about victory, not about pride, not even about survival. Battle is about protecting the possibility of change. Dragon Ball's greatest heroes are not the strongest fighters. They are the fighters who refuse to let violence define who they are. From martial arts discipline to Saiyan pride, to trauma and redemption, to divine enlightenment, to cosmic survival struggles, Dragon Ball constantly asks one question. Who are you when you are pushed beyond your limits? Not just physically, emotionally, philosophically, because in Dragon Ball, the final opponent is never just another warrior. It is who you were before you started growing, and true strength is not defeating others. It is surviving the person you used to be.